The 20th of January, 1832, Laramie Valley, Wyoming Territory. The temperature somewhere between -20 and -30. Wind cutting across the flats without interruption. 21 men are inside 3 log cabins they spent the previous month building. Their horses are already dying. The cottonwood trees they cut for forage turned out to be the bitter, narrow-leaf variety. The kind horses won't eat twice. The men have enough food. They have fire. They have walls. They have everything a log cabin is supposed to provide. By morning, one of them will note in his journal that his water froze solid inside the cabin, not outside, inside. His name was Zenas Leonard. He was 22 years old. And what he recorded that winter is a precise lesson in how a chimney can betray you, because what he and those men built, what every frontier builder built, was a structure that spent most of its energy heating the sky. That is what this video is about. Not fireplaces, not survival romance, but the actual physics of why a standard log cabin fireplace captured somewhere between 5 and 10% of the wood it burned, and where the other 90% went, and what would have happened if any of those men had built their chimney differently. Here's the claim. The fireplace is not a heater. It never was. In its standard open hearth form, the frontier fireplace was a device for making the inside of a cabin colder than it would have been with no fire at all. That sounds wrong. It sounds like exactly the kind of exaggerated hook that falls apart when you look closer, so look closer. An open fireplace of the kind built across the American frontier, a wide, deep box of stone or sticks and clay, connected to a straight vertical shaft, consumed roughly 24,000 cubic feet of air every hour to sustain combustion. That's the volume of a small house. The fire pulled that air from somewhere, and it pulled it from inside the cabin, which meant cold outside air had to replace it, squeezing through every gap in the chinking, every imperfect seal around the window frames, every crack between the logs. Add the heat that left the building as the cabin's warm interior air got sucked out alongside the exhaust gases, and the total thermal accounting looked like this. Roughly 80 to 90% of the energy in every log you burned went straight up the flue. The fire looked warm. The coals glowed. The man sitting 3 feet away was comfortable. Walk to the back wall and touch it, and it was cold. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's own documentation states it plainly. Most traditional open fireplaces lose over 90% of their heat to the chimney and draw additional heated room air out with it. Multiple building science engineers have documented cases where running an open hearth fire actively decreased the measured ambient temperature of the room because the infiltration load from replacement cold air exceeded the radiant output of the flames. Zenas Leonard's frozen water was not an anomaly. It was physics. Now, hold that image. The frozen water, the active fire, the cabin getting colder, and step back 2 centuries to 1753, Woburn, Massachusetts, where a child named Benjamin Thompson is born into modest circumstances, shows a preternatural talent for mathematics and natural philosophy, and will eventually become one of the most decorated scientists of his era. Despite the awkward detail of having been a British spy during the American Revolution, he fled to Europe. He became a count. He ran the Bavarian military. He founded the Royal Institution in London, and in 1796, while administering public works in Munich and observing the chimney problems in buildings there, he had an idea that should have changed everything about how Americans heated their homes. He published it. He called it Of Chimney Fireplaces. He described exactly what was wrong with every existing fireplace and exactly what to do about it. And his solution was so elegant and so obviously correct that within 2 decades, educated Americans were calling any well-built fireplace a Rumford, his adopted title, from a New Hampshire town he'd once governed. Thomas Jefferson installed them at Monticello. Henry David Thoreau mentioned them in Walden. Every person with money and access to a skilled mason got one, and none of that mattered to the frontier. By the time those 21 men were piling cottonwood logs in the Laramie Valley, Count Rumford's design had existed for 35 years. His paper was available. His principles were not secret. What he described was not complicated. They built a stick and clay chimney anyway, and the question worth sitting with is why. To understand what Rumford fixed, you first have to understand what he looked at. And the problem he saw is not the one you'd guess. Most people assume a fireplace loses heat primarily through its walls. The stone conducts heat to the outside, the energy bleeds away, and that's a real loss, but it's not the main one. The main one is geometry. A standard deep box fireplace has sidewalls that run roughly parallel to each other, angled slightly back. When the fire burns, it produces radiant energy, infrared radiation that travels outward in all directions, straight forward into the room, straight up into the flue, sideways into the parallel walls, where it mostly hits stone and bounces unpredictably, and backward into the rear wall, which absorbs it and re-radiates some percentage back. There is no systematic effort to aim the energy. Think of it like a flashlight pointed at the ceiling in the middle of a room. Some light reaches the walls, some bounces around and eventually reaches the floor. You could theoretically read by it, but most of the useful energy went to the ceiling where it's useless, and then out through the roof. Rumford's insight was that a fireplace is a radiant heater, not a convective heater. The useful warmth doesn't come from heating the air. It comes from the infrared radiation hitting your body directly, which means the only thing that matters is getting as much radiation as possible aimed at the people in the room. He cut the firebox depth to 12 to 16 inches, roughly 1/3 the width of the opening. And this sounds wrong. It sounds like a smaller fire would produce less heat, but depth in a fireplace doesn't produce more heat. It just moves the back wall farther from the opening, reducing the fraction of radiated energy that actually escapes into the room. So making it shallower means more of the fire's total radiation reaches the living space rather than the stone walls inside the box. Then he angled the side walls outward at 135 degrees, not parallel, but splayed wide like arms directing traffic. So those angled walls now reflected radiation forward toward the people rather than back toward each other. And every photon of infrared that hit a sidewall was aimed into the room rather than absorbed or scattered sideways. Then, and this is the part that addressed Zenas Leonard's frozen water problem directly, Rumford designed a constricted throat just 4 inches wide, with a rounded smoke shelf behind it. The throat restriction worked like a valve. A standard wide-open flue draws enormous volumes of room air because the pressure differential between inside and outside is roughly constant, and the area of the opening determines how much air flows through. But cut that area down from a foot or more to 4 inches, and the volume of room air evacuated per hour dropped dramatically. The fire still drew enough air to combust cleanly. Rumford was careful about this, but the chimney stopped acting as an industrial exhaust system for the entire cabin. The smoke shelf created a counter-circulation zone where cool outside air descending the chimney on cold nights downdrafts. The thing that fills a room with smoke when you don't want it was caught, warmed by the hot gases passing the other way, and redirected upward, which meant no backdrafting, no smoke in the cabin, and a consistent, reliable draft under almost all weather conditions. The combined effect was that a properly built Rumford fireplace delivered 2 to 3 times more usable heat than a conventional deep fireplace using the same amount of wood. ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, classifies Rumford designs as high-intensity radiant heaters and notes that occupant comfort can be achieved at ambient temperatures about 10 degrees lower than with warm air systems, meaning the walls don't need to be as warm, meaning less heat lost through the walls, meaning less wood burned. Now consider the campfire comparison, because the campfire is what most people use as their mental model for how a fireplace works, and the comparison breaks in an important way. A campfire in the open air heats you by radiation and by warming the nearby air, and the nearby air doesn't go anywhere. It rises slowly. It creates a warm zone. The wind disturbs it, but you can feel it a foot away. The campfire gets credit for warmth that a fireplace inside a building cannot replicate, because inside a building, the fire has created a chimney that evacuates the warm air before it can linger. The right comparison for a frontier fireplace is not a campfire. The right comparison is a hole in the wall, a large one through which the building's stored warmth is continuously evacuating while the fire works to replace it at a fraction of the rate it's being lost. There's a detail from Zenas Leonard's journal that doesn't get mentioned much. He describes the construction of those cabins in the Laramie Valley not with any pride or technical detail, but just as something they did because they had no choice. October 22, the cold made movement impossible. November 4, they broke ground and started building. They worked fast and built what they knew how to build: square-notched or saddle-notched logs, a chimney of sticks plastered with clay, a packed earth floor, whatever served as a roof. Leonard was 22 years old, and most of his companions were not engineers or architects. They were fur trappers, whose expertise was animals, where they lived, how they moved, how to set a trap and skin a beaver and stretch the pelt. Construction was something you did when you ran out of other options. And so they built the standard thing, the thing everyone built, the thing that had been standard in American frontier construction for 100 years before them. The documented fur trade forts were no better. Fort Bridger, built by Jim Bridger in 1842, was described by contemporary visitor Edwin Bryant as 2 or 3 miserable log cabins, rudely constructed, and Orson Pratt was more direct still: 2 adjoining log houses with dirt roofs. That was what the legendary Jim Bridger, after decades in the mountains, built as a permanent trading post. Fort Davy Crockett in Brown's Hole, established in 1836, was nicknamed Fort Misery. By the men who operated it, Thomas Farnham described a hollow square of 1-story log cabins with roofs and floors of mud. And Dr. Frederick Wisla Zenas called it a low, 1-story building constructed of wood and clay. Warren Ferris, one of the few mountain men who wrote prolifically about his experiences, explicitly stated that he moved back out of a comfortable log house and into a skin lodge because the lodge was simply better: more light, more warmth, less smoke. Ferris was right, and the reason he was right gets at something the journal accounts of this era keep circling without quite naming. The tipi is a heating system, not a tent. The smoke flaps at the apex were adjustable by external poles, not just vents, but directional air controls that could be aimed relative to wind direction to maintain optimal draw from the central fire. An inner lining of additional hides created a gap of dead air between it and the outer wall, functioning as insulation without any concept of insulation existing as a named idea at the time. Cold air entered at the base of that gap, flowed downward to ground level, fed the fire, and the convection loop drew warm air upward and out through the smoke flaps while the living space remained warm. A well-managed teepee fire with skilled smoke flap adjustment held the interior at a livable temperature in conditions that would have overwhelmed a comparable volume log cabin with a standard chimney. What the tipi could not do was anchor. It moved with the people. It required buffalo hides in quantity that required mobile hunting. It was a solution tuned precisely to the life of people who moved, which is why it worked, and why it was also, for a permanent trading post or a farming family, impractical. So the fur traders built log cabins and froze in them. And the thing, none of them discussed. The thing you won't find in any of their journals is that there was a design available that combined the real thermal advantages of the teepee's centered mass and directional smoke, management with the permanence of masonry construction. It already existed in New England when those men were freezing in Wyoming, and it had existed there since the colonial period. Herman Melville described his own home's chimney in 1,856 inches, a story called I and My Chimney, as having hearths on all 4 sides, 2 tiers of them, such that the family warming themselves in separate rooms were all effectively facing each other across the same enormous stone mass. He described the chimney's base as occupying more square footage than any room in the house and called it, without irony, the architectural and thermal center of the building. What Melville was describing impractically and obsessively, in a way that makes the story difficult to read, was the real reason central chimneys worked, and it had nothing to do with romance or excess. It was mass. A central chimney with 2 or 4 fireboxes and multiple flues serving multiple rooms contains potentially 4,000 to 10,000 pounds of masonry, stone, and brick that spent hours absorbing the heat from fire and then continued, radiating that stored energy outward for hours after the fire died down. Walk past such a chimney at midnight with the fire out and the stone is warm, and in some well-documented colonial homes, the chimney breast stayed warm enough to be perceptible to the touch 36 hours after the last fire. This is not mystery. Stone has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.2 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. So, a 5,000-pound stone mass heated to an average temperature 100 degrees Fahrenheit above the room absorbs 100,000 British thermal units and released over 12 hours. That's 8,333 British thermal units per hour of slow, steady, radiant warmth, roughly equivalent to a small wood stove, running continuously without burning a single additional log. The more immediately important thing about a central chimney, though, is where it sits. Every frontier log cabin built in the Rockies and the Great Plains followed the same template. Chimney on the end wall, outside the building envelope, at the gable end, touching exterior air on three sides. A chimney on the outside of a building is exposed to ambient cold. The masonry chills to the outdoor temperature when no fire is burning. And when you light a fire, the first enormous amount of heat energy goes not into the room, but into warming cold stone, back up to a temperature where it can sustain draft. Cold chimneys draw poorly, backdraft easily, fill rooms with smoke, and throw almost no heat. More critically, an exterior chimney radiates its stored heat outward into the outside air rather than into the living space. The energy baked into the stone by your fire goes to warming Wyoming in January. You paid for it. You burned the wood. The outside received the benefit. Move the chimney to the center of the building, and the stone is surrounded on four sides by warm interior air. It never chills to outdoor temperature. Draft is consistent because the flue gases travel through warm stone rather than cold, and all the stored heat in that mass, every single BTU of it radiates inward, into rooms, into living space, available to the people who generated it. That is the first and most consequential thing that makes a central chimney different from what the frontier built, and it has nothing to do with the number of fireplaces, it has to do with the location. An interior chimney with 4 fireboxes, 2 on the ground floor, 2 accessible from upper rooms, or a common space connected to separate flues, sharing a common stone mass does something no single hearth exterior chimney can do. It stays hot all the time. When one fire dies down, another is lit. The stone never drops. And in a home with 2 rooms in use during cold weather, the chimney mass can be kept above 150 degrees Fahrenheit around the clock just by rotating fires, letting one room's fire die to coals while the other blazes, then reversing it for sleeping. The stone radiates continuously. The draft in every flue benefits from the warmth of the others. There are no cold starts and no smoke at 4 in the morning when a tired person adds the wrong log to a dying fire in a chilled flue. This is what a 4-way arrangement actually provides, not some mystical ability to draw wind from all compass directions, because chimney draft doesn't work that way, and 4 open throats facing 4 directions would create cross drafts that compromise each other, but rather sustained mass, sustained temperature, and the possibility of staggered fires that collectively maintain thermal stability. The campfire dies and the warmth dies with it, but a stone wall that spent 6 hours next to a campfire keeps you warm for the next 6 hours after the fire is out. And scale that up to 5,000 pounds of masonry and 2 carefully managed fires. And you've built something that behaves less like a campfire and more like a slow-release thermal battery. And that is what the frontier never built. Now consider the numbers precisely. A 1.6 by 2.0-foot log cabin, 320 square feet, roughly the average size of a frontier trapper's or settler's structure with 7-foot walls of green pine logs. A rough-cut wood roof, a packed earth floor, and a standard stick-and-clay exterior chimney with an outside temperature of -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The occupant burns 40 pounds of wood per hour. Seasoned softwood runs about 7,000 British thermal units per pound, which is 280,000 gross BTU per hour going into the fire. At 5 to 10% efficiency, the documented range for a stick and clay open hearth fireplace, the room receives 14,000 to 28,000 British thermal units per hour, and the other 252,000 to 266,000 British thermal units goes out the flue or drives cold air infiltration. Meanwhile, that 24,000 cubic foot per hour air consumption means the cabin exchanges its entire air volume multiple times per hour, and at -20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, every cubic foot of cold replacement air that enters must be heated from -20 degrees to somewhere near room temperature before the room can be comfortable, a load that partially or fully cancels the heat the fireplace is delivering. The measured result was that near the fireplace you might have 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while the back wall, the back bedroom, and the overnight temperature were commonly recorded in 18th and 19th century diaries at 25 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Water freezing inside the cabin on washstands, in pitchers, in the corners of rooms away from the fire, was so routine across the frontier and early settlement period that diarists stopped noting it as unusual. Samuel Lane of Stratham, New Hampshire, recorded it matter-of-factly in the mid-1700s, and scores of others did the same. Now change 3 things. Move the chimney to the center of the building. Build it with 4 fireboxes, solid stone, 5,000 pounds of mass. Apply the Rumford geometry shallow firebox, angled sidewalls, 4-inch throat with smoke shelf to each of the fireboxes, and keep 2 fires burning on a staggered schedule. At 25 to 30% efficiency per Rumford fireplace, each fire delivers 70,000 to 84,000 British thermal units per hour. So, 2 fires together produce 140,000 to 168,000 British thermal units per hour. The constricted throat reduces air consumption by roughly half, cutting the infiltration load significantly, and the centered mass adds hours of stored heat radiation with no additional fuel. Equilibrium interior temperature on the same -20 degree night becomes 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the cabin, not just near the fireplaces, because the central mass radiates in all directions, and the reduced infiltration means warm air actually stays in the building long enough to matter. The difference between those 2 scenarios, the standard frontier cabin and the optimized one, is 30 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And 45 degrees is not a cherry-picked outlier, but the midpoint of a well-supported physical range. And not one of the 21 men in the Laramie Valley in the winter of 1831 to 32 built it. Not because the knowledge didn't exist, it did, but because knowledge and application are separated by something the history books don't explain well enough: access, material, skill, and the brutal economics of time when you're building with desperation in October and the snow is already falling. The Rumford fireplace design was published in 1796. The mountain man era in the American West is typically dated from the early 1820s. Ashley and Henry's first organized expeditions through the late 1830s when the fur trade collapsed. That's a gap of at least 25 years between the design existing in the public record and the period when it could have theoretically changed how men wintered in the mountains. But the Rumford never traveled west. It was an urban design. It required skilled brickwork, the angled sidewalls, the precise throat dimension, the smoke shelf cut to the right curve, and rural frontier builders could not replicate it in mud and sticks. A proper Rumford required a mason, and masons didn't follow trapping brigades into Wyoming in November. Central chimneys had existed in New England from the 1600s, the colonial tradition of building the chimney first, before the house, and constructing rooms around it was common knowledge, but it required planning. You couldn't build a central chimney in the middle of an emergency, because central chimney construction meant dedicating the first weeks of a project to nothing but stone and mortar before a single wall went up, which was counterintuitive when you needed shelter from the cold that was already killing your horses. The mountain men knew the right answer was skin lodges. They said so repeatedly. Warren Ferris said so. Osborne Russell's journals show a man who spent the bulk of his 9 winters in the Rockies in skin lodges, not cabins, by choice. The Rocky Mountain College, the winter evening tradition of debate, storytelling, and philosophy that Russell described from the winter of 1836 to 37 happened inside skin lodges, not log cabins. The cabin was not what the mountain men preferred. The cabin was what the settlers who came after them built, because settlers couldn't move. And those settlers, the farming families, the trading post operators, the homesteaders inherited the stick and clay chimney because it was what they knew, what was fast, and what everyone else was building. And so the 90% loss continued, decade after decade, family after family. The thermodynamics don't change based on whether you know them. That's what cuts through every romantic reading of the frontier. The men who survived the winter of 183–132 inches, the Laramie Valley survived because they had enough wood and enough food, not because their chimneys were good. They froze inside their cabins and endured it. Zenas Leonard spent 4 months in that valley and didn't come out until the 20th of April, 1832, on foot, leading 2 surviving mules that represented almost nothing of what had gone in. He had built a chimney that sent 90% of his heat into the sky. He burned more wood to compensate. The wood ran out faster. More labor to cut more wood. More cold exposure to gather fuel, a compounding spiral driven by a design problem that had already been solved in a paper sitting in libraries on the eastern seaboard, in fireplaces in Jefferson's Virginia and Thoreau's Massachusetts. The log cabin is the symbol of American frontier self-reliance, and the fireplace is the heart of the log cabin image, the warm hearth, the crackling fire, the family gathered close. That image is not false. It's just incomplete. The family gathered close because close was the only place warm enough, because 6 feet from the fire it was cold, and 10 feet from the fire it was cold enough to freeze water in a cup, and the family huddled at the hearth because the hearth was a 10% efficient space heater in a 1,000-square-foot box with R8 walls and 0 effective insulation at the joints. Now imagine the same family, same cabin more or less, same weather, but the chimney is 5,000 pounds of stone at the center of the building running 2 Rumford fireplaces, the smoke shelves cut correctly, the throats narrowed, the side walls angled to push radiation outward, the stone hot to the touch at midnight, the children sleeping in the back room where the stone radiates through the wall. That family doesn't huddle. That family spreads out into the full space of their home. The stick and clay chimney didn't die with the fur trade. It became the template for a century of American construction that followed. The westward expansion, the Homestead Act, the settlers who arrived in Kansas and Nebraska and Wyoming in the 1870s and 1880s and built what they could afford with what they could find. The Rumford fireplace, which should have been universal by 1820, was still largely unknown to rural Americans in 1870. Cast iron stoves began arriving in greater numbers after the Civil War and slowly displaced open hearth fireplaces, and a cast iron stove at 30 to 40% efficiency was right from the start, 3 to 4 times better than what it replaced. Not because of any radical innovation, but simply because a closed combustion system with controlled air intake couldn't accidentally exhaust 20,000 cubic feet of room air per hour, the way an open flue could. The wood stove fixed the air problem but did not fix the mass problem. A cast iron stove has no thermal mass to speak of. It heats up fast, cools down fast, and when the fire dies, the room follows within an hour or 2. The masonry heater tradition that was common in Scandinavia, Finland, Russia, and Germany for centuries, the Finnish contraflow design, the Swedish kakelugn, the Russian stove achieved efficiencies of 85 to 95% by routing exhaust gases through serpentine channels inside a massive masonry body before letting them escape, capturing nearly all the combustion energy in stone before releasing it slowly. A University of Oregon study measured a contraflow masonry heater at 79.5% operating efficiency. Mother Earth News documented one that heated a house for 21 hours on a single loading of wood in January, exhausting gases at only 170 degrees Fahrenheit instead of the 600 to 1,000 degrees, typical of an open fireplace. None of that technology reached the American frontier. The frontier used what arrived on the frontier. The open hearth tradition of early American settlers who had themselves brought it from England where open hearth fireplaces had been standard since the medieval period, when people accepted that winter inside a stone hall was only marginally warmer than winter outside, and that burning wood was a race between consumption and cold that you ran every year and hoped to survive. What Rumford understood that almost nobody else saw clearly is that the problem wasn't the fire. Fire is fire. It produces roughly the same energy per pound of wood regardless of where you put it. The problem was the container. The problem was what happened between the moment combustion occurred and the moment heat reached a human being. Every inefficiency in that pathway, every cubic foot of air unnecessarily sucked out of the room, every degree of temperature in gases needlessly exhausted before the masonry could absorb them, every BTU radiated backward into fireplace walls instead of forward into the living space was not a loss of fire, but a loss of design. He thought about fireplaces the way an engineer thinks about a system. Every component has a function. Every function should be optimized for the goal, and the goal is not burn wood but warm people. So a system that burns wood brilliantly and warms people poorly is a bad system regardless of how impressive the flames look. The frontier built impressive flames. The frontier built 6-foot wide fireplace openings because a big opening felt like more heat. But it didn't produce more heat, it just allowed more of the room's air to escape faster. The wide flue that drew powerfully and never smoked was admired across the frontier. It was exhausting the building at industrial rates, and nobody measured what that cost, which meant the chimney everyone wanted big, powerful, drew so hard the fire roared, was the chimney doing the most damage. By the 20th of April 1832, Zenas Leonard and his surviving companions left the Laramie Valley on foot. They had arrived mounted on 30 horses and left with 2 mules. The horses had starved on cottonwood bark the animals wouldn't eat. But there's a line in Leonard's account that gets less attention than the horse losses. The men were not in desperate physical shape. Cold, thin, tired, but functional. They had survived on adequate food and fire and the most basic possible shelter, which means they survived despite their chimney, not because of it. If you took that same valley, that same winter, and put those 21 men in 3 cabins with properly centered masonry chimneys, Rumford proportions, 4-inch throats, 5,000 pounds of stone each, they would have been warm. Genuinely warm, sleeping in your shirt sleeves warm, the kind of warmth that is simply absent from every written account of frontier log cabin construction during this period. The technology was not missing. The technology was on a shelf in a library in Boston. The miss was not dramatic, and it wasn't a single moment of bad decision-making. Nobody sat down and said, "Let's build the less efficient thing." They built what they knew, under time pressure, with available materials, in a context where it works well enough to keep us alive, was the only criterion anyone was measuring against. But works well enough to keep us alive is not the same as works. And the 90% that went up the chimney wasn't wasted in some abstract sense. It was wood. It was hours of labor cutting and hauling wood. It was cold air infiltration that killed the warmth of the back rooms. It was the reason families slept pressed together near the fire rather than spread through the house. It was the reason water froze inside cabins with active fires. The real weight of Rumford's contribution is not the design itself, but the question the design asks. He sat in front of a standard fireplace, the kind every educated person in the Western world had been sitting in front of for centuries, and asked why it worked poorly. Not accepted that it was cold, but genuinely asked why. That question seems obvious in retrospect, but it was not obvious at the time. The fireplace was such a given, such an assumed and universal feature of every building, that asking why it was bad was like asking why the sky was up. You dressed warmly and fed the fire and accepted the cold past 10 feet from the hearth. Rumford didn't accept it. He measured it, redesigned it, tested it, and published a paper that said, in effect, that people had been building these wrong for 1,000 years. Here was the correct way, and here was the physics that proved it. The frontier received that paper, eventually, in the hands of educated men who put it on their shelves and continued building stick and clay chimneys because there was nobody available to build anything better. The actual story of the frontier chimney is collective and slow and unsatisfying in the way that real history usually is. A solution existed, it was available, and it didn't travel. The people who could have used it didn't have access to the skills to build it. The people who had the skills were in cities where the problem wasn't as urgent. And so the gap between knowing and building stayed open for decades, while 90% of every cord of firewood on the American frontier went straight up into the cold air above the chimney top. There are masonry heaters in Scandinavia and Finland that have been running at 85 to 90% efficiency for hundreds of years. The contraflow principle, routing the exhaust gases through a serpentine path inside a massive stone body before letting them escape, was documented in German construction manuals by 1618. Franz Kessler described a stove with 5 separate chambers through which gases passed before reaching the chimney, capturing heat that would have otherwise been wasted in an open fireplace. Most American homes built today still use forced air systems that heat air rather than objects and people, which is a less efficient approach for comfort than radiant mass, though far more efficient than an open fireplace. The open fireplace, still installed in new homes, still operated romantically rather than practically, still exhausts 80 to 90% of its potential energy upward and outward, is a direct descendant of the same design that made Zenas Leonard's water freeze inside a cabin with an active fire. The same physics that Rumford identified still govern every fire in every hearth in every home in the world. What Rumford gave us was not a new principle, he gave us a clear look at a very old failure. He put numbers to it and drew a picture of what correct looked like, and proved that correct was achievable by anyone with a skilled mason and adequate stone. The question he asked, why is this so bad when it could be so much better, is still worth asking about almost everything. The Laramie Valley in April 1832. The horses gone, the snow finally soft enough to walk on. Zenas Leonard, 22 years old, and making his way out on foot, he would go back into the mountains the following year, continue trapping for several more seasons, and eventually write one of the most detailed accounts of the Rocky Mountain fur trade that exists. He never described his chimney design. It didn't seem worth noting. The sky above the Laramie Valley, all winter long, was warmer than it should have been from all that wood, all that heat, rising through a stick and clay throat that sent 90% of everything those men worked to generate straight out into the cold above their roof.